I was prompted to write this article because after Dave Smith went on the Joe Rogan Experience and did such a fantastic job talking about Yemen, there was a short discussion of it on the Tim Pool podcast with the guest on the show, Cory Mills, who's running for Congress and, has one of these, well, I'm a tough conservative, but I'm also non-interventionist attitudes. And he put out there that, look, Dave Smith is misrepresenting what's happening in Yemen. It's more a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And so that's what I really address in my article. I write, next month, the war in Yemen will turn 7. At a minimum, the war has killed 400,000 people. For several years, many notable aid groups have considered Yemen to be the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Over half the population relies on food and medical aid, now being scaled back due to a lack of funding. Millions of Yemeni children are malnourished. Many are dying from starvation. The destruction of the war will plague Yemen for decades to come. The primary cause of Yemen's suffering is the Saudi-led coalition's multi-domain war on Yemen. Yet, calling the coalition Saudi-led obscures the essential roles that the US, UK, and UAE play in waging the war. The war effort is primarily led by Saudi Arabia's Air Force, which is dependent on the US and UK. If one were to peel off the Saudi warplane insignias, it would reveal their American and British origins. The US and UK continue to maintain Saudi air fleet, which would be grounded if the support was withheld. And so just to get into this a little bit more here, when we're talking about, maintaining the plane, so almost the entire Saudi air fleet is either UK or US made fighter jets, right? Like F-15s, 16s, things like this. Tornadoes, I think our Typhoons are the UK fighter planes that they use. And so, you can't fly those things 1,000 times without doing like routine maintenance, even if nobody's shooting at the planes and the pilots are all doing their job perfectly, replacing the tires and the brakes and, I'm sure far more complicated things than I understand or, explain, requires very frequent and expensive maintenance of these planes that are provided by U.S. defense contractors. And so withholding those contracts, which the government can do because it is a weapons sale essentially, would be something that could be done by the US and UK and very quickly end the conflict going on here. But that is not what's happening. And in fact, the US and UK continue to do that, even though Biden said February, not of 2022, but of 2021, right after taking office, that we are going to end Saudi support for Saudi's offensive. He did use the word offensive, which at the time on this show we said was just a loophole that he could drive an entire war through and has. But this is all this support is very important. And then, of course, continuing to sell Saudi Arabia missiles, and the UK has continued to sell Saudi Arabia bombs. So all this is very important. Getting back to the article, the Saudis' bombing campaign frequently hits civilian targets. Recently, Riyadh bombed a communications building and knocked out the northern Yemen internet for several days. That strike also killed children playing soccer. Shortly after, Saudi Arabia used an American-made bomb to kill 91 people at a migrant detention facility. The recent war crimes are a part of a more extensive campaign directed at Yemen's civilian population. In a report for the World Peace Foundation, Martha Moody describes the food war waged by Saudi Arabia. If one places the damage to the resources of the food producers alongside the targeting of food processing, storage, transportation, urban areas, and the economic war, there is strong evidence that the coalition's strategy was aimed to destroy food production and distribution in areas under control of Sana'a, or that would be the Houthis, as described above. From the autumn 2016 economic war has compounded physical destruction to create mass failure in basic livelihoods. And so that was from Martha Mundy's report. Continuing my article, American officials have assisted the Saudis bombing with intelligence and target selection. Some U.S. officials even worry this level of involvement will expose them to potential war crimes. Despite its horrific effects on the civilian population, Riyadh's bombing campaign has proven ineffective against Houthi military operations. From June to November, Houthi sources say Saudi strikes killed 15,000 fighters. Still, the casualties did not prevent the group from making substantial gains in the Mareb and Shabwa provinces. Another prong of the coalition's war effort is backing Proxy ground forces in Yemen. And this is, by the way, the Saudi side of the war. Iran, would never be referred to as the coalition. Yemeni journalist Nasser Arabi report that the UAE and Saudi Arabia are backing al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Further investigation by CNN revealed jihadists were using U.S.-made weapons that were originally sold to the Saudis and Emirates. Recent losses by the Houthi in the Shabwa and Marib provinces came because Salafist militias backed by the UAE, the Giants Brigade, was deployed to the region. The militia quickly reversed Houthi gains that cost months and thousands of lives. And so, this is something that I had talked about in the past on the show, this advance by the Giants Brigade in the Shabwa and then the Marib provinces, and how this was a militia that was backed by the UAE, but also supportive of the Hadi government, and that is the Saudi side of this war as well. And that even before it happened, the recent missile launches by the Houthi against the UAE, I was talking about on this show how it would be a potential retaliation move by the Houthis to lash out and fire missiles at the countries backing the militant groups that are pushing into their territory and things like that. So back to the article here. The U.S. and Saudi Arabia have also weaponized the UN against Yemen. The U.S. pushed the UN to pass Resolution 2216, which Saudi Arabia has used as a legal pretext for its actions in Yemen. In 2021, using blackmail and bribes, Saudi Arabia pushed the UN Human Rights Council to remove its investigators from Yemen. Since the vote, the Saudis have significantly escalated the air war. January 2022 was the deadliest months for civilians since 2016. Despite the Saudi air campaign's brutality and ground fighting, the Saudi economic front is the most deadly. Riyadh enforces strict inspection requirements for ships attempting to bring cargo to Yemeni ports. These requirements amount to a de facto blockade. Aid groups report that desperately needed medical supplies, potable water, and food often wait off the coast while people die of preventable causes. The U.S. helps Saudi Arabia enforce these inspections. Additionally, Biden is currently considering redesignating the Houthis, adding them to the foreign terrorist organizations list. The move will have little impact on Houthi leadership, who are already subject to U.S. sanctions, but aid groups warn the move will have devastating impacts on civilians. The caustic FTO label was slapped on the Houthis in the final days of the Trump administration, literally the last 3 days of the administration. But after some deliberation, the Biden White House was removed the designation because of its unproductive cruelty. To further Yemen's economic woes, Saudi Arabia has flooded the Yemeni market with newly printed Yemeni rials. To combat rising inflation, the Houthis stopped allowing recently dated notes to circulate as currency. Riyadh responded by finding some older dated notes to pump into Yemen. Despite Washington's escalating role, it has gone nearly uncovered by the U.S. media. Adam Johnson reported on his Substack, The Column, a recent review of MSNBC coverage from November 3rd, 2020 to November 22nd, 2021 shows MSNBC hasn't run a single segment on the U.S.-backed war still raging in Yemen. This is why Dave Smith's recent 10-minute discussion of Yemen on the Joe Rogan Experience was so important. For the first time, tens of millions of Americans were exposed to the story of Yemen. More crucially, Smith presented presented the story without the typical pro-empire spin, with nearly all Western coverage masking America's leading role and framing the conflict as a Saudi-Iran proxy war. However, Smith was attacked on this issue by TimCast guest Cory Mills, who argued that it was Smith who failed to provide proper context. Mills launched his argument that the Houthis are an Iranian puppet force by saying, "You are failing to understand what the Proxy militia force is from Iran," and there he's talking about the Houthi. And so that claim is simply incorrect. The Houthis are primarily Zaidi Shia, a native population of Yemen. The group existed long before and fought several different battles with the government, the previous government of Yemen, led by Ali Abdullah Saleh. And so, you know, this isn't like some uniquely Iranian bad proxy force to take on the Houthis. And in fact, in late 2014, the U.S. worked with the Houthis to target their common enemy, AQAP. Now, about 80% of Yemen's population lives in Houthi-controlled area. Mills goes on to claim that Iran was caught shipping mid-range ballistic missiles to Yemen, and a UN report confirmed his claims. He also said the Houthis had carried out strikes that shut down the Saudi oils company Aramco and targeted the UAE. The Houthis do claim responsibility for a September 2019 attack on a Saudi Aramco facility that for several days caused production to substantially drop, though Saudi Arabia and the U.S. led a group of states claiming Iran was behind the attacks. The UN has said it is unable to independently corroborate the cruise missile and unmanned aerial vehicles used in these attacks are of Iranian origin. The Houthi also claim responsibility for the most recent attacks on the UAE, while an Iraqi militia claimed to be responsible for one attack. No evidence has emerged Iran played a role in those attacks on the UAE. The Houthis' drone attacks are a predictable consequence of the UAE's support for the Giants Brigade and AQAP. Now, I just want to note here that in the past on the show, me and Connor Freeman, who's the co-host of the show, had talked about that when these recent attacks on the UAE happened, we thought it was actually notable that the UAE was only blaming the Houthi and not pointing the finger whatsoever at Iran. A 2015 UN report from a Security Council expert panel found Iran had been assisting the Houthi from 2019 until that point. However, Gareth Porter debunks the report's central claims, explaining that Yemenis were smuggling weapons out of Yemen. And so there were 2 or 3 examples that they were able to pull in that report. And, Gareth goes through and debunks them all in this article. I linked to it in my piece. But just very quickly, I think in 2 of those cases, the ships were found to have weapons, but those weapons were leaving Yemen for Somalia. And part of the reason for this is that Yemen is one of the most armed countries in the world. And so that, they really don't need to send small arms to Yemen because actually like second or third on the list behind the U.S. and maybe Iraq is where Yemen comes in and how well the civilian population is armed. So the weapons weren't going to Yemen, they were leaving Yemen. And then there was another ship that was intercepted, and they claimed it was an Iranian smuggling ship going to Yemen, but they failed to find any weapons on that ship, so that's another major problem. Then more, I want to address more of the claims here. Not that Mills doesn't bring up any examples actually when he says that. He just says, UN reports back his claims. So in my effort to steelman his arguments, I did go and do a pretty thorough search and find all the most because people made statements all the time that the Iran are backing the Houthi, but I did try to find the ones where the claims were made had maybe the most substantial parts to them, or did involve the UN. And so the 3 examples I was pulling up there were the 2019 Aramco attack, where the UN says it didn't happen, the 2015 expert panel, which Gareth Porter confirms, and then getting back to the article here, In 2017, Nikki Haley, then Washington ambassador to the UN, stood in front of scrap metal and claimed to have proof that Iran was providing Houthis with missiles. Not even the New York Times bought the flimsy evidence, reporting the Trump administration tried to mount a case on Thursday that Iran violated an international agreement to limit its arms dealings, but American officials failed to show how a range of weaponry presented as evidence proved those charges. The Houthi and Iran have political ties. This should be seen as a normal relationship. While it's common for the Houthis to be called rebels or terrorists, for over 7 years, the group has ruled Sana'a, Yemen's capital city. In fact, a recent trend in Yemen is for people to leave Saudi-held territory. For the Houthi-held areas, increased security and stability. So some ties between Tehran and Sana'a should be expected. Further, as the Houthis are governing Yemen, it's logical that they would seek to strike against Saudi Arabia or the UAE, since those states are waging an aggressive, unprovoked war against Yemen. And even if Tehran were selling weapons to Yemen, compared to the American weapons cause suffering, the consequences and the suffering caused by the Iranian weapons would be absolutely consequential. All the reports from the aid groups, absolutely all the reports from any groups on this conflict absolutely show it's primarily the Saudi blockade and the Saudi air war that's causing the majority of the problems for the people in Yemen. So I wrap up here with saying, for Mills to claim that Smith was leaving out context, a claim that host Tim Pool seemed to back at the end of the discussion, is laughable. However, Mills' claim is unsurprising. There is a growing trend of Republicans who claim the title of non-interventionist while proudly repeating the war state's talking points. And that's exactly what Mills does here. He doesn't necessarily say that America needs to remain really involved in Yemen, and he kind of stumbles through that part and says, I'm a non-interventionist. But at the end of the day, when you're reporting and confirming the war state's narrative, you're doing their work for them, and you're taking America in that direction. And so anyways, again, one thing I really do want to take another second to highlight is Dave's appearance on the Joe Rogan Experience is so important. Anytime you read an article, anytime there's a news segment on Yemen, it's very rare that I hear where it's not almost framed within the first 30 seconds, the first 3 paragraphs. This is a conflict between Saudi Arabia and the Iranian-backed Houthis, the Iranian Proxy group Houthis, and all this. And what that does is it tells everybody it's okay to support this war because this war is about combating Iran. And that's just absolutely not the case. It hasn't been from the start. As Dave points out in that article, the Obama administration told the Washington Post that this was about placating the Saudis because they were concerned that when America was signing the Iran nuclear deal, it would pivot America towards the Iranian side in the Middle East. I guess, Iran is a less brutal government than the Saudis. And so if you want to, maintain the demand that and point your weapons at somebody who's acting poorly, that, they could really just shift focus and support the Saudis. After all, or the Iranians, after all, the Iranians oppose the terrorist groups, AQAP, al-Nusra, ISIS in Syria and Iraq and things like that, whereas Saudi Arabia has supported these groups. And so actually Iran would maybe make for a more natural ally. So Saudi Arabia had that dread. Also at that time, the deputy crown prince and prime minister was, I think, 29 years old. That's Mohammed bin Salman, who's now the full-on crown prince and often considered the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia. And basically he saw an opportunity to be a young hotshot, come in and label the Houthis as an Iranian-backed group. They don't have an air force, and so he thought he would go in with his air force and his special operations troops that were trained by the U.S. and wipe out the Houthis, and it just absolutely didn't happen. They named the operation Decisive Storm, and here we are 7 years later with, if anything, the Houthis have made gains. I guess if you look since maybe December, then the UAE Bat Giants Brigade has made some gains in the Mareb and Shabwa provinces. But generally speaking, the past 7 years, the gains have been made by the Houthis, or, the territory has remained pretty status quo. And yeah, and so the reason for the U.S. Getting involved in this war was, to help Mohammed bin Salman's profile and placate the Saudis over the Iran deal, so they won't continue to throw a fit about that. And this is all very important in what is the real context that people should know about the Yemen war. I think that's kind of what I want to mention on my article. I do have a couple news stories here on Yemen. The White House is continuing to look at adding the Houthis to the foreign terrorist organizations list, which would make it criminal to do any kind of business with the Houthis, and it'll make it a lot harder to bring aid into that country. The very nefarious Brett McGurk is one of the main people pushing this. Also worth noting that the State Department labeled the Houthis' most recent attack on Saudi Arabia as a terrorist attack. Of course, the U.S. never even often mentions or condemns when Saudi Arabia, say, drops a U.S.-made bomb on a migrant detention facility and kills 91 people, but yet, that when the Houthis fire a missile into Saudi Arabia and no one is killed or one person is killed or something like that, then that's a terrorist attack. And so that label does seem to indicate to me that even if they don't move forward with adding the Houthis to that list this time, that they're going to be doing it in the future, and they're just building the need, building closer to it. Saudi Arabia again attacked a telecommunications ministry building in Yemen, this time in the capital city of Sana'a. From my understanding in some recent communications I have, I believe there is still internet in Yemen, and there's no reason to think that they knocked out the internet with this most recent attack. The Houthis are blaming the escalation in Yemen on the U.S. and Saudi Arabia, and so that's pretty interesting that and something that comes up from reporting on the ground in Yemen, where they call this the American war. This isn't Saudi Arabia's war, it's the American war. And that was the other really critical point that Dave Smith made on Rogan. And then this, I think the last story I have on Yemen was 5 UN staff members were abducted in southern Yemen. This is in the capital city of Aden, that is controlled by Saudi Arabia, where you had UN staff members that were just snatched up. I tried to do some digging. I couldn't really find who was claimed to be behind this attack yet, if it was motivated by ideology or monetary incentives or something like that. But it does, I think, go to show this situation in Yemen pretty clearly, and why people are moving to Houthi-held territory, because, again, even UN aid workers are being snatched up, on the ground in southern Yemen.